everyone, so today I'm going to show you all how I did this really pretty pink peony. It's actually pretty simple. You only need a few tools, so honestly any pencil will do. I just used this number 2 mechanical pencil and any old eraser just so we can erase our pencil marks before we do the ink marks. Then I used this Staedtler pigment liner. I used a 0.1 size. It's my favorite size to use. I think it's really perfect for details. And then I used this number 4 brush. You can use a smaller brush if you would like. Just make sure it has a really nice point to the tip of it. I used a slightly larger brush, so if I push down it makes a thicker line, but then it also has that nice tip to make a thinner line as well. And then I used this Rowney set of watercolors. We're really only going to use 3 colors, the 2 that I pointed out, the pink and the green, and also a yellow, which I forgot to point out. So I'm starting off with my pencil by drawing really thin lines. Make sure they're very light, very thin. Don't push too hard so that we can erase them easily later. And I'm just blocking out where I want my peony to be. So I'm drawing a circle where I kind of want the shape of the flower to be, and I'm just doing little blobs where my leaves are going to be. And just a reminder that this is what we're drawing, or painting actually. So take a screenshot and put it up on your phone or anything so you can keep looking at it as you go along. So I'm just going to go in and sketch out where those petals are, keeping it to the shape of where I drew my little blobs earlier. You don't have to draw your petals exactly where I did mine. If you make a really big petal and therefore you want to subtract the one next to it, or you drew some small petals and you want to add more, perfectly fine. I'm just keeping it within the shape of my circle that I drew because that's what will make it look really nice as a flower if we're keeping it in that circle shape that we started with. So I'm looking at a reference picture, but I'm not doing the exact petals that they did just because, you know, you're going to have slightly different sizes than my drawing, and so just do what fits in your circle and what feels right. I'm also going through those leaves and drawing those as well. We want our lines to really show us where our ink is going to be, but they don't have to be perfect. We're going to perfect it with the ink. So I'm going in with my Staedtler pigment liner, and what I'm doing is I'm going over where I've drawn my pencil, but I'm adding a little bit more detail. So I'm adding a little squiggles in my line, a little bit of variation because my pencil was a kind of a general shape. And so with the pen, I'm just adding a bit more variation, which is what will make it look a lot more natural. You know, petals are going to have little ripples in them, little tears, little folds. And so we just want to add those little tiny squiggles in our petals so that they look a lot more natural. So I'm just going in and doing that over my whole flower, adding little squiggles. If you want to do a fold in your petal, like you see I'm doing a few here, I just do a big squiggle going inward and then a straight line across the top. It makes it look like a nice fold in your petal. And I think those add a nice bit of detail. And again, just adding little squiggles. So I like to hold my pen really lightly and go over where my pencil was. And if you hold your pen light enough, it makes adding those little squiggles and variations a lot easier. So I didn't film this, but I let my ink dry for about 20 minutes and then I erased. You don't want to erase too early because you might smudge your ink. So I let it dry for 20 minutes to an hour and then I erased those pencil lines. So now we have the ink. I'm using my pen to add little details on the bottom of the petals, little lines, and a few on the top of the petals for 2 reasons. First, to show the veins in the petals, but also it adds a nice shadowy effect. So I'm adding more lines on the base of the petals and a few on the top where there might be some little ripples. Now, if you have a smaller size pigment liner, you could use a 0.05, but what I do is I just use that same size pen, just hold it really lightly and do those lines really quickly. It's going to give you a very thin line. Practice a few before you go in on your peony, but just holding it lighter, doing quicker lines are going to give you a thinner, more detailed look. Just going quickly through my peony, and again adding more lines on the base of the petal and then just a few on the top where there might be some little ripples to show the veins and the shadows. I'm also doing this on my leaves as well. So now it's time for paint. So I'm getting my brush pretty damp, but you don't want it dripping. And I'm just getting my first petal wet. You don't want it to be a big puddle in the petal, but you definitely want the whole petal to be damp. Then I'm taking my pink paint. I've got a nice amount of water on my brush as well as the pink pigment. And I'm going along where we started those lines. So on the shadowier parts of our petal is where we're going to put that paint. And because our whole petal's wet, it's going to seep into the rest of the petal as well. I've cleaned my brush with water and I'm just wiping it with my fingers so it's a tiny bit damp and it has no paint on it, and I'm using it to blend. And as I blend, I'm going to get some pigment on my brush, so I'm just using my fingers to wipe that pigment off because I want to make sure I'm just blending and not depositing any pigment. Now I'm just going quickly through the rest of my flower, and the way I'm doing my petals is one by one. I know it's quite annoying to do it that way, but it just makes it look so much nicer if you do it one by one. And I'm making sure to paint petals that are not next to each other, because if you paint two petals that are next to each other, the water will run into each other and you'll ruin your ombre effect because it will just bleed into the petal that's next to it. So I'm kind of doing it in 3 rounds. I'm doing kind of every other petal until I run out of petals that are not next to each other. I let it dry for either an hour or just come back to it the next day. And then I come along and I do every other petal again until I run out of petals that are not next to each other, until I've done the whole flower. It's quite annoying to do it this way, but if you do them one by one and you do it in rounds like that where they can't bleed into each other, it just makes it look so much nicer, and each petal just looks so much more detailed, and they each have their own individual ombre and shadows, which make it look a lot more natural. So again, I just did it in 3 rounds, making sure not to do petals that are next to each other at the same time so they don't bleed into each other. So next, I'm grabbing that same pink, but because I've let the whole flower dry by now, and I'm using less water when I'm picking up that pink, it's gonna look a lot darker. So same color, we haven't mixed it or anything. We're really only using that pink, that green, and a yellow, and we're not mixing them with anything. By adding water or using less water, we're gonna make our colors either thinner or darker. So in this case, we're using a darker version of the pink, we're using less water, and our flower is dry. And I'm just going in on the parts of the flowers where I put the pink earlier, where the shadows are. And I'm just highlighting those by using more pink. So either the base of the petals or where a petal might be under another petal is where I'm putting that pink. And then we're going to do the whole flower just like that, every petal one by one. This is kind of my favorite part though, because I just love this pink color and you kind of just get to trace the petals a little bit. So again, we're going to blend just like we did with that first petal. I've cleaned my brush. I've made sure that it's a tiny bit wet, not dripping, not too damp, but not dry. And I'm going in and I'm blending that pink that I added, and occasionally when I notice that my brush is picking up pigment, I'm just going to pinch it with my fingers or just clean it again in the water. We want to make sure that our brush is blending. It's damp enough to blend, but we don't want to pick up pigment. We don't want to be depositing more pink. We just want to be blending the pink that's already there. So pinching it or cleaning it every so often will help keep the pigment off and just keep it lightly damp enough to blend our shadows. So now we're going to do the stem and the leaves. So I'm getting that green color that I showed earlier. I've gotten a lot of water on my brush, so it's a very watery, lighter, sheerer version of that green. The paint's going to move really easily, and I'm just covering the stem and the leaves with that same very watery green color. Making it waterier will help us cover it faster, the paint will move easier, and we just want it to be covered in that green. We're not really trying to do any variation of color here, just trying to get it all with that green color. And I'm just going to pick it up with that same green, but now that everything is dry, and I'm going to add much less water when I'm picking up that green, so it's going to give us more pigment and a darker color. And I'm just shading in right on the vein of the leaves and also along the bottom to give a little shadow. I've also added that green at the top of the stem where the flower might be adding some shadow on the top of the stem. So just the veins, the bottom of the leaves, and at the top of the stem where there could be some shadow. And then anywhere else where you might see some shadow if you did a slightly different positioning than I did. Now I'm going to go in with that pink color and once again add more details. I'm using that pink with much less water, just like we did on those shadows, so it's going to be a lot darker, much more pigmented, and I'm adding little lines with the same idea that we did with when we did it with the ink. It doesn't have to be exactly where you did your ink lines. You don't have to be covering your ink lines or have the same amount of pink lines as you did with your ink lines, but it's the same idea. We're wanting to show the veins of the petals and also where there could be shadow. So again, I'm holding my brush really lightly and doing really quick lines to make sure that we have that detail. The same way we did with the ink, holding the pen lightly and doing those quick thin lines, we're doing the same with the brush. And once I've finished my whole flower with those little lines, I'm just going to grab a yellow color, which I forgot to show you at the beginning, but any yellow will do, and I'm just filling in the little seeds. Same color, no shadow, really easy. And that is our peony, all finished. Just 3 colors, adding either more or less water to show the darker pigment or have it a sheerer color. It's super simple, making sure you're letting everything dry in between layers, and we're all done.